Oh,
Hello.
Dimitri, how are Cheetan and
Hey, man.
Dimitri? How are we doing today?
I think that's the worst question you could have asked.
Oh God, okay. Well, how is life blood still pumping through your body today, Dimitri? How does that sound?
I'm grateful for this fact,
Oh, good, good. It's
to
good
say
to
the
and
least. And
Daniel Frega, my goodness,
I
Mr. Frega, how are we doing today?
What up, guys?
Oh, it's good to
grateful to be
see
here
you.
as
What
well.
a
This is going to be
treat.
great.
My gosh, my God. Well, it's good to see all of you today. Now, Dimitri, I know you've been doing these wonderful talks on the science of logic, so I salute you. I'm curious, Dimitri, what have your thoughts been or some of the thoughts going through your head as you go through the science of logic with our beloved Hegel?
Fuck. Uh,
That
so we're reading
actually sums it up,
the
actually. That's actually
yeah,
that's like, yeah.
it
Technically,
does. It does, but we're actually reading the lectures on logic, which are lectures Hegel gave throughout the years as a university professor, and they have been written down. Their transcript has been created by his son, who was 18 when Hegel died in 1831. And so there's a discussion about, how much Hegel is this and how much is this Hegel's son, because it's very good. So most likely he and his son have had discussions about those transcripts. And yeah, they're super interesting. He says things like logic is a science of truth. And of course we have the science of logic, but then what is logic? Logic is the science of truth, which is something to contemplate about. And yeah, he starts off talking about Plato and Aristotle, and about how Aristotle conceived of the faculties of the mind. So let's say thinking, sensation, willing, in the terms of the understanding. So that means he understood an object in the same way as he understood the mind and thinking. That's kind of what Hegel claims, which is of course not what we should do if we actually want to dialectically think through these things. So then he goes on about he has this sentence. He says, "The rose is red." Now this seems very sensuous, but in fact, is non-sensuous. When we're talking about we're talking about being, and there's nothing sensuous about being. He says this. So then we have created the universal into an object. We have there's this thing in Hegel that you can ask the question about mathematics: do we discover formulas or do we create the formulas? And I think Hegel's claim by the universal that comes to fruition by thinking, because thinking is the activation of the universal itself, we kind of discover and create at the same time. This comes to fruition simultaneously. So yeah, those lectures are they're very easy to read compared to his other works. So I would highly recommend them to anyone, for sure.
Well, Dimitri, I appreciate you sharing. And Tom, Bethany, great to see you today. Tom, it's a real pleasure. Tom, are you in Australia? It's got to be like pretty early in the morning or something like that. I salute you, my friend.
I'm in New Zealand.
In New
I
Zealand.
rolled out of bed 2 minutes ago and now I'm being blasted. This is how I like to live.
So this is the meta version of a cold shower, because now cold showers are like the thing. You take them and you're 10 years younger or something like that. So I salute you, Bethany. Great to see you as well. And yeah, Dimitri, it's interesting. So a few things. I know Dr. McGowan will say that we should take the philosophy of history, I believe, with a grain of salt, since that came out of the students who kind of recorded. And how many professors would like the notes that their students take about their lectures to become an official book? I know he says things like that. But it's interesting to compare that, perhaps the difference with, say, his son taking the notes and how they went through the different things. And also on what you're saying. And just so everyone knows, if anyone has anything to say, just speak or raise your hand. Either way is perfectly fine. You can shoot off a firework or a flare as well. I'm a big fan of flares. They kind of add a nice sort of special effect to the video. So if anyone has flares, feel free to shoot those off. But there is this interesting component where in Hegel, the very guardrails, if you will, that thinking follows actually arises with thinking. So like if you have a car on a road and you're kind of stuck in the guardrails, you're not technically stuck in the guardrails, but you kind of are, right? They're going to block you. You can do some free movement within it, but the guardrails keep you from going so far. So likewise, the logical thought simultaneously creates the rules of logic in which that logical thought has to follow, which is so freaking weird, because then it's almost exactly what you're saying. If we ask, oh, is math created or realized, right? Well, it's created, realized. So it's like, but that's where what's so interesting in Hegel, it's like Hegel wants to suggest that the laws of logic are not things you can just arbitrarily change. They are, in fact, laws that logic has to follow. And yet at the same time, they arise with the logical considerations. So it's like the road and the guardrails are made at the exact same time. In the same way that the mathematical rules, if you will, are created at the time of the equation. I think that's a much more complicated, because you're kind of, instead of saying is math created or realized, you're saying, well, it's created, realized, or it's realized in its creation. And that's all fun and happy.
Let me speculate. Isn't the separation between creation and discovery sort of the beginning of alienation? So I'm just perusing the beginning of Surplus Enjoyment by Zizek, and there's a bit where he speaks about how Marx had this really smart insight via Hegel, that sometimes the value of a commodity becomes, via these sort of Hegelian shenanigans, right, that I'm not really versed in, but that's the concrete value of the thing manifests sort of a universality. Or in other words, the fact that there's a Roman law and a German law almost invents the fact that there's this metaphysical abstract law. And mystification is the idea that there's originally sort of the abstract one that then births the other two. And I'm thinking that the difference between this creation and discovery might have something to do with alienation from the Marxist sense, alienation from the ability to produce the means by which your own thought creates its own guardrails. I'm going off on a limb here.
I would like to respond to that. So when I started reading Hegel, I got very hysterical. And at a certain point, I was like, how can you even make distinctions at all? How can you even do that at all? And in the lectures on logic, Hegel says that saying that everything, everything is self-identical is the same as saying that everything is contradictory. So, my reaction was like, okay, but then where the hell do we go? But of course, like Daniel, you just, OG Rose Daniel, by the way, like you just kind of explicated, it's really in that temporal mediation itself that this comprehension of the dialectic that comes to the that it is realized, that it is actualized. So that is a extremely confusing process, but I don't think you have to be very intelligent to understand Hegel necessarily. Like Hegel says in the lectures on logic, it just takes a lot of practice. We are not used to doing such violence to our understanding, to use the technical word. But with practice, you can do it. Everyone can do it. And on Frege, on what you said, so concrete universality is actually how actuality manifests. By the way, anyone can correct me because I still haven't read The Science of Logic. But I think that an easy way to explain this is that something is a concrete universal by failing to be what it is. And through this very failure, it's actual. It is a concrete universality. So it's the failure of that abstraction that you kind of pointed to.
Well, I'll make a comment very quickly. And David Gosley, it is a true joy to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well. It is a delight. David has also been doing a reading group on Immanuel Kant, so I salute the man for leading that. And he's also been doing tremendous book reviews. I've actually, on my Better World book cart, my wish list is basically David's channel, so I salute him for that. So you better get royalties, Mr. Gosley. But on the point of this notion of alienation and realization and creation, it is quite interesting because there's something about when you realize something, it feels authoritative. You go, oh, that's great, because it's like realized. It's not just arbitrary. It's like actually there. Math is realized. But then the problem is it's impersonal and it doesn't care about you. Oh, that kind of sucks. That's kind of alienating, right? It doesn't care about you. But if you create it, you can go, oh man, I made this. It really matters. And then you go, oh, but I created it. It's kind of arbitrary. Who cares? It's just my little project, right? So there's this interesting way in which there can be an alienation that comes from a realization that something is transcendent, if you will, something more than you. But then there's an alienation that can come from the feeling of it being arbitrary because you created it. Either way, one has to do a certain kind of, to use Dimitri's language, violence to their understanding, so they can actually see themselves in something that's realized and go, oh, well, I'm part of something. Maybe they say, oh, I'm actually part of something bigger than myself, and find belonging in that bigger thing. Or if they create something, they say, well, yes, it's kind of arbitrary because I made it, but it's the only thing in the universe that will ever be this thing. And so there's a way to fight alienation based on a kind of violence you commit against maybe your initial impression on the thing, that can start to kind of bring it together, because you start saying, well, actually, now that this thing it is a thing that can be realized by other people, because I have created a thing that can be realized by others. And in creating it, I have expressed something that is not expressed anywhere else. So there is something about seeing both of those in play in different ways that I think can, in fact, can fight alienation. And with that, anyone who wants to speak, please.
Like you say, Dimitri, the subject is a subject through its failure of being a subject. Andrew Tate is this weird guy. You probably heard of him online. And what he sells is first of all, his desiring strategy is the Girardian coquette, meaning he projects this image of the perfect being. And therefore, you must think to yourself, why, if he has perfect being, I want perfect being too, because I desire how he desires, and he seems to desire himself very much, so I want that too. And then how to achieve that? You sort of mimic the trappings of perfect being, these projected trappings. Obviously, you subscribe and you pay money and you try to look like him and you say controversial shit. But it's almost like he's monetizing the failure of subjects to want to become as him, and their failure to become as him is precisely how they define themselves as audience of him. This is a tricky flip. It's typical Hegelian flippity flop, but the way that it looks like is precisely in how people fail to be like him is how they are made subjects, i.e. paying subscribers, which is, like, from the point of view of the philosophical formula, rather perfect in terms of desiring engineering, so to speak.
I think what Hegel wants us to see a destabilizing element in basically everything. Whatever it is, it also entails its destabilization. So if you make a nice, neat formula where the name of the game is to escape alienation by creating something, well, then you're going to find that there's an alienation in creativity because it can feel arbitrary. If you make a nice, neat formula where you escape alienation by realizing everything, well, then you're going to fall into alienation because then it feels like you're not part of it, right? So then Hegel's like, well, actually, how can you see the destabilizing element in both, come to commit a violence against your ordinary understanding so that you can see the possibility of aligning with it? No, you never fully overcome existential tension, but you can start to develop the habits of handling it in a manner that isn't, I like to say, effacing, that doesn't lead into pathologies and different things. We're always going to have symptoms, but we can come to terms with how to habituate ourselves with those symptoms so that we can be strange in a more fun and endearing way. And I will just add to what you're saying. So likewise, Hegel would be like, hey, look, in the audience is a failure that makes them identify with it, where if they lose that failure, they cease to be the audience. So what if that means there's actually an incentive to create failures in people so that they're the audience and that they're paying people? Wow, that could be a problem. So maybe we need to look for the destabilizing elements in what turns people into speakers or into, say, audience members, so that we can complexify that. And we're never, ever going to escape tension, but maybe we can avoid forms of capture that we don't want to be in, or maybe we can see different ways that we need to approach things. So I think you're right, Mr. Frege, that we have to see the ways that actually within each member of that system, there's a little bit of the other that then needs to be destabilized.
I have a question, just because I am so green to Hegel, and so this question might be completely nonsensical, but and I can't really contribute anything, but where does
our video just got 1,000 views. There's a cat now. Thank you so much, Bethany.
Yeah, hopefully she only ever does this when I'm on Zoom. Where does interpretation come into this? Because in terms of in terms of math and logic, there's is math discovered? Is it created? You can't really there can't really be interpretation in the laws of logic, right? Because logic can't be interpreted, it can only be sort of explicated. Is that correct? Is that a correct way of framing it? And where would interpretation come in to building up of a subject, either the subject himself building himself up, or whoever is subjugating? Where does interpretation come into this? I just want to hear people's thoughts.
That's a tremendous question. And then Dimitri, you're more than free to speak. Zizek has this funny way where he'll say, Marx said the point is not to interpret the world, but to change it. And Zizek's like, no, we need to go back to Hegel because the point is interpreting. Because how you interpret the world determines how you carry yourself in the world. And since you can't really predict the future without doing a sort of violence to it or ending up totalitarian, what's actually better to do is to try to interpret the world in a new way that changes how you see yourself in the world, which as a result changes how you carry yourself in the world, and therefore changes the future in that way, where it's more through the interpretatable structures. Interpretatable, wow. The structures of interpretation of the subject. And I think, I was just speaking with Jacob about this on the idea that we often ask the question, what should we do with our lives? We actually almost want to kind of ask, where do we want to carry our lives, in the sense that we need to ask the question of who we are now and interpret that and carry that into the future, as opposed to making some sort of plan that we're going to fit ourselves into, because Hegel's always very concerned that in doing that, you end up in something violent or totalitarian or something like that. So to your question, we have to decide, 2 + 2 = 4 looks the same on a sheet of paper any other day, right? But we have to decide if we think it is created or realized. And it's actually hard to imagine how exactly would you prove if 100% that it was created or realized, right? What would that be? You'd almost need a transcendent observation in order to determine that, right? You just get to the point where you say, well, we've done so much mathematics so often and it's proven so accurate that surely it has to be realized and not created. But you can always say, well, you're just focusing on the math that works and ignoring all the math that doesn't work, right? So there's always going to be a level of uncertainty. And so you have to interpret what it is. And what Hegel wants to suggest is that we, and by the way, Bethany, we're all actually green on Hegel, because you can read Hegel your entire life and you're still behind by about 3 centuries. So don't worry about it. But there's something about where Hegel wants to be we all naturally interpret by ordinary consciousness, which tends to get us stuck in dichotomies or maybe master-slave dynamics or different things. What we have to do is, by speculative reason, work out of that so where we can interpret things as actually entailing otherness within them. And that's where to move, as Dr. McGowan will say, and then I'll pass it on, to see the contradiction in things, not contradiction in the sense of a kind of logical contradiction that leads to effacement, but to see a kind of tension that then has to be held so that the world doesn't end up in various efforts of escaping contradiction that leads to totalitarianism or pathology or neurosis, if we're following McGowan's thinking, or Zizek. And so interpreting tension as part of things, as opposed to evidence a thing is doing something wrong, will transform how you approach the thing and then how you would carry it into the future because of that interpretation. And that would kind of be kind of what we're discussing in all of this, Bethany.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that so there's this science of logic, and we can think dialectically about that, and there's meaning and interpretation, and what you actually feel about something, to put it extremely simply. So how do we connect those two together? And I think it comes in with desire. The fact that you have a need, that means that is negation, and that is contradiction, because that means you are finite, you're limited, and everything that's limited basically is contradictory, because when you equate it with itself, that means that either it comes to an end, which means the formula doesn't work anymore, or it's either that, or what Hegel calls, the technical term is abstract. So when you have abstract desires, let's say you want to have a car, or you want to have money, or you want to make the best banana ice cream, to allude to Daniel's example, you work in the world, and you are in this world which resists you. You got all the ingredients, make it together, and then you have the concretion of your abstraction, and it turns out it's really bad. like you made bad ice cream, you didn't want that car, or whatever, you're not satisfied with your house. So then you have that desire again. And I think really I'm thinking this in its infancy, and I know Bart is alluding to it in his paper, but I haven't read that yet. And that's the word project, because we have object, which is a kind of static and ossified in space, but project is more aligned with desire, and the actualization of a dialectical actualization of project seems to me the way to go. And also allude to your Daniel's, your claim that we have to enjoy the symptom and learn ways in which the world is self-othering itself and be with that tension itself.
Yeah, just to jump in really quickly, because it feels like it's not so much, and this is what I've been toying with recently, it's not so much the attainment of the object of desire that we desire, but obviously the desire itself. It's the Lacanian point. You want to struggle towards the desire, but once you reach it, it's not really that cool. So coming back to interpretation seems to be like a struggle with the world, a struggle of positioning towards understanding as an object of desire. The reason why we enjoy reading or being curious or eating banana ice cream or making banana ice cream, maybe banana ice cream is the wrong example because I love to eat it, but it is, this relative position vis-a-vis the object that generates the tension, the fruitful tension that is what you want to reach, right? I mean, for example, at work, we're trying to think about what does it mean for a chatbot, an AI bot, to have personality. It's not so much to give it a very well-designed set of things that it likes to say, that, quirky or zany or sarcastic, no, but rather, can we place the contradictions? Because that's the definition of personality, is a set of contradictions. It's a set of conflicts. It's a set of wants that are not fulfilled. And that's structure identity, right? So the way to think about project but it might be better to think about project as the deployment of contradictions and unfulfilled desires than the actual engineering of getting from A to B.
I've been reading Mr. Raymond and Joshua Hansen, who I adore. They had a discussion on Paul Virilio, which actually made me think of your work, Mr. Frege, because you always will talk about when we invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. And part of the conversation was Paul Virilio's reflection on the idea that you don't actually discover what is the substance of a thing. Like he's making that play on words with the word accident, like in Aristotle, for example, an accident is a non-essential quality and the substance is the essential quality. For example, whiteness would be accidental to a cat, whereas perhaps you could say the genetic code of the cat is the substance of it because it is essential. Also too, before I forget, very nice pun with saying fruitful contradiction after talking about banana ice cream. That was really well done. I was very impressed. That was great. And God bless all of you for liking banana ice cream. So there's also this kind of notion for Paul Virilio it is precisely in the accident that you find out what is accidental versus the substance. So for example, before the 2008 financial crisis, you could say, oh, what is the substance of capitalism is small business. Then 2008 occurred and it says, well, no, actually the substance of capitalism is the banks in the financial sector, whereas the small business is more accidental to it or different things. Now that's just an example that I'm making, but the notion is that it is not until the accident that you unveil what is the accident, the accidents from the substance. So likewise, it's almost like it's not until desire is upset that you find out the actual substance of a desire, what is actually accidental to the desire as opposed to what is substantive of it. And it's interesting is that in the upsetting of desire, when desire does not reach its goal, you actually find that what you desire is desiring, right? Or to like the factor of desiring, to have something to seek. And we can ask, well, that sounds weird. Why do people like desiring primarily? Well, because there's a few reasons why. You don't have to face yourself. You always have a source of distraction. You always have a source of existential hope because once I, have that thing, I'll be happy. You always have a sort of motivation. And also if the desire is pre-existing, you don't have to ask yourself, what should you desire? Which can be existentially terrifying and overwhelming and stuff like that. So if you desire desiring, which is to say the perpetuation of desiring kind of automatically, without any much level of reflection or having to admit that actually whatever you obtain by your desire will simply be contradictory as well. It won't give you ultimately what you're looking for, that sort of weight of glory or whatever that Lewis will talk about. Well, then you don't have to face yourself as a subject of which is such. that is positioned that way. So then to pass it on, it just makes me think that the notion of the upsetting of desire to unveil what actually desire is about, is the desire of desire, kind of makes me think of Mr. Virilio's notion that the substance is unveiled in the accident.
Hello, everyone.
Emilio, that is a good looking haircut. Look at this guy. Man, it's good to see you, Emilio. I hope you're well today, sir.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, just to quickly add to what you said, Daniel. For me, it's the desire. It's interesting in the sense that, for example, you can you can have the desire, but you can also desire a specific desire. Like, for example, you know that you should go to bed early, right? To sleep early. So you can, like, you're tired, it's 11 p.m. like, okay, you're done, you desire to go to bed and you go to sleep, and then everything's well with the world, you're like a happy person. That's cool. But sometimes you're like, oh, I'm really watching this movie I really like right now, I don't want to go to bed, but you want to go to sleep, you know, you want to go to sleep, you want the desire to go to sleep. So I think that's a really interesting thing, because almost like, of course, like we don't desire the thing, it's always like the act of desiring is what we want, but also I think it's really funny that we have a desire for a specific desire. So that I think that's an interesting thing. And just to add another thought of the mathematics thing that was mentioned by Bethany, like I find that it's like, for example, when we can't know if something is one way or the other, I think a useful heuristic would be to see which thing is real or not, to see which one is more useful. Like, for example, if we think of mathematics as being something that we create versus we discover, like as Daniel said, we would need like an overview position to determine. So and we can never have that. So maybe the useful thing to do is to see, okay, if we take like an a priori, like take a stance that, okay, we create mathematics or we discover them, which is more useful to the purposes we have, right, to create more mathematics or whatever. So those are just the two thoughts I want to add. And yeah, thank you.
No, and I'll just add and pass it on to the wonderful David Gosley. In Hegel, there's this notion of, if it can't be made concrete, is it even real? And I always kind of
like that as a kind of test of use, because it's like, because use can be relative to a certain kind of framework of what defines practical. But when you say, can you make it concrete? Well, you know, that kind of brings in a certain test. But I'll give it to Mr. Gosley. Mr. Gosley, it is a pleasure to see you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot, Daniel. I really missed you, and also Chetan, and great to meet my new friends here. I want to kind of step back a little bit and then hopefully return to the topic at hand. I want to talk in terms of human relationships and bonds. And we can recognize some relationships, some bonds that kind of come with more restrictions on our desire. Daniel Froggatt referred to Andrew Tate and that kind of relationship, that kind of belonging, a kind of belonging that imposes a set of standards on you. Like, you have to be a cool guy, smoking cigars every evening, you know, fancy watches and cars. And if you want to belong to us, here's a paid subscription arrangement. But there are also bonds where that is not the case. There are human relationships where it is the recognition of human individual, the unique being of the person, and the possibility of desiring is wide open for us, for the person who has that bond. And then Bethany's note on interpretation also comes in. In both of those scenarios, people are interpreting their belonging. They are interpreting their bonds. So the person doesn't say, I want to smoke cigars and drive fancy cars. The person says, I belong to this club. And then, so that's the way they get into the question of who I am in terms of my relationships, what kind of community I belong to, and what kind of desires I have. Why do I want to go to bed early? Because I belong to the set of people who go to bed early and like they're productive when they wake up, go take care of business. Yeah, that's it for now. Thanks again.
What then do we make of people who or maybe this is a premise that I have to throw out, but what then about the people who are like the trendsetters, the people who like create these groups to which we desire belonging. Yeah.
So, and then I'll pass it on to Mr. Titan. It's interesting because as I like to talk about the movement in Hegel from self-consciousness to reason, that's a movement where, so we go from consciousness to self-consciousness because we encounter another self-consciousness and we need them to the formulation of our self-consciousness. But then there's a step of identifying with otherness, which is kind of a little deeper, which is then it's a kind of choosing to see oneself as entailing otherness and needing otherness in order to be themselves, which is to start to identify with kind of a tense contradiction, as we start to say. So there's something about choosing how to interpret bonds, how to choose to interpret a relationship. Is this person I'm encountering an opportunity for me to identify with otherness, or are they in the way of, my hopes and dreams because, they're keeping me from the new car or something like that? Like there's an interpretation of a bond that has to take place. But I think that's really important. And then I'll pass it on to Titan, because the meaning of bonds is not self-evident. Like you say, oh, you're born in a family. That means you love them. Well, then what does love mean? Yes, maybe you do, but what exactly does that mean? Do you like them? What if they abuse you? There's different questions that have to be asked on that involves an interpretational question. I think that also gets into the trends and different things, because if you choose to see this as a trend worth following, or if you choose to see this as so that it's worth being productive every single morning, why do you choose to interpret that as being the case? And why do you choose to interpret that in a manner that you ought to pursue? So I think those are interesting questions. So Mr. Titan, it's a pleasure to see you, sir.
I'll just sort of enter into it from a different angle in some senses. And I'll take this question of bond and belonging, little from a different, from a perspective of natural science. I'm reading a book called What is Life by Urban Schrödinger, and I would recommend it to everybody. It's an amazing, work if you're interested in the questions of physical chemistry and quantum mechanics, genetics, So one of the things that comes out while reading the book is, and I think, and we can get to the thing, that if you look at what desire is, desire in itself is a question of satisfaction through other means. If you were just satisfying your drives, you would not need desire. Life would never exist. Life would get over immediately it starts, And if we look at, and that is why when Freud talks about this relationship from drive to desire, he talks about the long circuit. He talks about taking the longer route, and that is where I think the question of failure comes into picture. The drive has to find its own failure immediately, and and one can immediately say not all failures are same. One can always add that to it. We can always fail better and fail again. So when you start taking that seriously, we start thinking that at what point does life actually functions through holding its own tension? By what I mean, it able to find a way to create negative entropy, because any system in pure thermodynamical terms, if you leave it to itself, it will always find a natural equilibrium with this environment, and that is death, nothing else. In Freudian thinking, that is death. And when a system simply finds equilibrium with its environment, system is over. It cannot do, and eventually, that is what life is heading towards. But it's heading towards through longer routes, and desire always sort of enters into this contradiction with its own self, and that is where identity comes in. Identity allows you to hold life while embracing some form of death at the same time, while embracing some kind of form of equilibrium with the environment at the same time. And that is where you create your home, you belong, you create those kind of spaces for yourself. And yet the challenge remains that how does a human being, while all his actions are geared towards creating the maximum entropy, there is a split there through which we are able to create negative entropy, through which we are able to sustain life for a longer period of time, and so on and so forth. And how do we think through? And that is where I think thinking comes into picture. If you can't think, you can't sustain life. Thinking becomes one of the ways through which you can sustain life more than it actually can. Otherwise, you simply act like animals, you'll have this much to go. And I think this is one way I think to think through that question that I think Dawood is raising for us, that in what ways do we belong to something? And I think the ways through we belong to something are not simply given to us in advance of our own desire itself. There's something more happening there which we need to struggle with.
Fantastic. Fantastic. As you're talking, I'm just thinking about the excess, right? Enjoyment is always the enjoyment of the excess, the surplus enjoyment, which reminds me of Bataille's accursed share. This idea that the sun has to spend, produces so much energy and only a little bit of it actually gets actualized in the earth and life. And so too it is with our desire. It must seek satisfaction everywhere, and perhaps only in its excess or impossibility. Only when it fails its goal does it meet its true goal, right? It's almost like that's the dialectical way of the death drive, playing the game of spirit as it unfolds through time and history. And I'm super interested in this idea of, there's like 7 or 8 different kinds of ways to think about desire, and it's really tricky right now to sort of square them all up together, but its negatological aspect is super interesting, right? Because you copy the trappings of going back to the Tate example, right? You copy the trappings of this character that's playing the coquette strategy, and you want to mimic it, but you mimic it by putting yourself in a position of you're paying for in a submissive, almost BDSM position of you pay to try to look like it. It's for all of the excessive masculinity that this narrative has. It's also extremely homoerotic, right? Oh my God, I'm going to pay to be like you. It's almost like financial domination in a way. And I like to see these flips. I like to think that these death drives type things. I don't know.
I have a question about this. So it's probably going to be extremely naive, but bear with me. Desire and drive it seems like drive is circular.
Yeah.
And that in this circle, it's an imperfect circle, and that's what makes the circle work. Whereas desire seems more linear and symbolic too. It's tied to a signifier, whereas a drive maybe isn't necessarily tied to like the getting hold of this signifier and having this complete effacement and ossification of it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you guys view that? Perhaps the symbolic and the imaginary are also interesting to think along this line of thought. I see Cadell already gave an answer.
Yeah, so Cadell in his absence has made his presence felt, as it was his strategy all along. Desire wants the lost object, whereas drive enjoys loss itself. And we will not hear more about this.
See, now we have to decide if we're relating, and I'll give it to you, but are we relating to Cadell via desire or drive? Maybe that's what we need to ask. Yeah.
Exactly. I don't know, but the desiring constellation that is forming here by him being absent, by him saying no, my God, this is the template. This is the formula of desire. It's like you want to know, but you won't know. Oh my God, I want to know. And there's something there, right? He's probably so it's probably desire, right? Because you want the lost object, the Cadell that's not here. That's what we want. But it probably relates to our own death drive insofar as we enjoy loss itself. We enjoy the non-having of things in general. I don't know if that's a fair assessment of drive and desire.
No, and Demetri, that's not a naive question at all, because, in a conversation, desire is being used as a simile for drive at 1 second, and then vice versa, and so on and so forth. And then we're talking about banana ice cream. So, it's not naive at all. There does seem to be a difference, for example, between, say, I would like a cup of water because I'm in a desert and I will die if I don't get the cup of water. And in fact, I actually generally do want the cup of water. Like, this is not a sort of psychological trick on myself. Like, I literally need the water. And if I would to use desire and drive, maybe not quite the same as being positive, but it's be like, so I am biologically driven to get water so that I do not die, right? So you could say it's a desire,
kind of is a desire because I don't want to die. So, you know, I mean, not in that situation. I mean, maybe if I were going off one of those mountains in a squirrel costume and it was this really cool blaze of glory and I hit something, you know, that would be great. The flying squirrel costumes. I hope somebody knows what that is. If not, just laugh and, you know, do that for me. But anyway, so you have this sort of drive, which actually in that situation, you genuinely want the object and need the object and in fact must get it, right? Whereas desire, what's interesting is there is this sort of play of you desire something that you believe you genuinely want, but then it can also be doing some sort of psychological gymnastics where you're desiring this thing in order to distract yourself from something else. And actually you just want to desire desiring. And there's some more complicated dynamic that's going on. Whereas if, let's say you just, it's funny too, because desire seems to actually make us continue to care about drive, because if we didn't have any desire, it'd be like, what's the point of drinking water? What's the point of eating? What's the point of these things? Because there's no deeper meaning to it all, you could even say, that the desire can provide. But then what's so weird is desire has this sort of contradictory function that's going on within it, that if is unveiled to us too starkly, can be psychologically overwhelming because the real can be overwhelming. But then if it's totally denied, that can cause pathologies. And then if it is unveiled in the wrong way to the wrong proportion of where, say, one can handle it at the time, that can lead to pathology. So there's this very complex art form, as I like to think about it, that goes into having one let the nature of their desires be unveiled to them in a manner that does not lead to effacement. But let me give it to Mr. Dimitri.
There's a lot there. And we touched upon the desire of the desiring desire itself. But isn't that drive? It seems then it is circular and then it's drive, if we use this terminology. Or is that a wrong question?
No, and I don't mean to grab the floor back. No, that's exactly right. Okay, so that's really good. There is something about Hegel that is very interested in taking something that we think is not determined in so desire feels like something that's an expression of autonomy, right? That it feels like it's something that we create and that is for ourselves. But actually, it turns out that desire has a kind of necessary function to keep us going, right? Which then can be kind of overwhelming if you encounter that and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not as free as I thought. I'm not as much of an agent as I realized. But then Hegel is like, well, actually, part of absolute knowing and part of the name of the game is to actually see freedom in that very limit, to identify with that very limit and come to terms with it. So there's absolutely what ends up, this is what's so interesting. So you start off, you know how we said everything has the destabilizing element in it? So you kind of start off with there being a difference between drive and desire, right? You know, but then as you go along, you eventually can come to the place where you say, no, actually, they both contain a little bit of the other within the other one, which in one way can be terrifying because you're like, oh my gosh, my desires are just a reflection of some biological drives. Oh, I'm just a robot or something like that. But then actually you can say, well, no, actually by learning to, there's something freeing in that because then I'm not a slave of my desires. I can choose to identify and participate in them if I so want, but the relationship becomes one of learning to hold a limit and to see freedom in that limit, to see identification in that limit, as opposed to a denial of limit. So those are all, to me, what you're getting at are those kind of complicated moves that Hegel wants to make, where you identify with limit, where limit is what makes freedom possible, but also attacks the very freedom in being that limit, that makes an individual identity something that you can handle, but in the same time restricts that individual identity. So I think what you're getting at is pointing to that.
Affirming renunciation is interesting, right? Because affirming the limit, the inherent impossibility. But if instead of trying to overcome that as if that was possible, and rather affirming that deliberately, that's the root of authority. Because authority is first and foremost the ability to say no to yourself. But if you flip that around, it's not a denial of desire, but an affirmation of its limits, which is sort of dialectical or weirdly, it's actually empowering.
I think one sort of way to think through this desire drive dichotomy, and we can I think go for hours on it, but would be that I think there is a fundamental problem when you relate human being to his own needs. You know, that if I remember reading Vygotsky, and I used to teach Vygotsky actually a long time back in my language discussions, and Vygotsky starts his a famous language and thought from this example that Freud is wrong. And Freud is wrong because when you see a child being born, he doesn't only believe in pleasure principle. He also wants milk, and milk is a real thing, and reality is already implicated. And that struggle that Vygotsky is having with Freud, it's a very old one in that sense. If you read Freud from outside its own psychoanalytic discipline, I'm saying, if you read it from inside, we can, again, as I said, we can go for a long time. But the struggle essentially was that how does human being relate to his need while being true to a certain egoistical formation of ego in consciousness. And that problem eventually emerged to a point where Freud's answer to it was, and you can see that development in his writings, that something happens because of which human being is already alienated from his own need at the time of his birth itself. It's not that he needs something, a child needs milk in that very strict sense. A child is alienated from his own need, and that alienation, that vacuum is being covered by something called drive, which always circulates around the object. It can never get that object in that sense. And that struggle with need in some senses leads to this conceptual apparatus of drive and desire, which is why desire can only be reduced to drives. It's not that you can ever get pure drive or pure desire in any real discussion. These are conceptual terms to actually articulate this problem of developing a relationship with the need. That relationship is not already given to us. There is something fitting where need should have been fitting. And then how do we think from that horizon now? That there is some kind of a problem in the human being, that there is already something, it's like musical chairs. A seat is already taken, which somebody else is supposed to take. And then how do we find a seat for that thing, and how do we empty a seat, another seat gets filled, and so on and so forth. Yeah,
I really love this. I was recently reading Alenka Zupancic, Kant and Lacan, where Zizek has a foreword, and he talks about the decentiment of the subject, which is kind of what you're getting at. We're constitutively decentered. We don't start off in a centered place and then contingently get thrown off of it. And he has this fascinating example. It's really mind-blowing. He says that if we talk about pure thought, it's kind of it's something that Kant was getting at, and that when we have a pure thought, you lose both thought and being. And in losing both thought and being, you arrive at like an epistemological failure that also points an ontological failure. So that's how I kind of read what everything that you said. It's such an interesting topic, and also you can connect it to primal repression as well.
No, I like, now I've written down desire, drive, and need, and kind of thinking about those three and their relation. I like that bringing in of need there, and I'll pass it to Mr. Emilio here.
For me, it looks apparent in the sense is that we are incomplete in the sense that like desire, like our very structure of or acting, as you said, like prerequisites that's very incomplete, so we strive towards something, right? Towards a car, towards like food and anything, right? So like from our very, like we wouldn't walk places if we didn't desire something in that place, right? So like our very good thing that makes our composition is in a sense there's a lack of something, but and not only well, these words can have like negative connotations. Are you're incomplete, you lack something, but it in this way is more descriptive than like judgmental, in the sense that, for example, if we look into nature and we see like a magnet, right? Like if it's like a positive and a negative, they attract each other, right? So it's just like in that sense, like you could say like a magnet is incomplete until it like reaches another opposite, but it's just like describing the way it attracts in each other. And I think it's, well, it reminds me of the book I keep mentioning, of Incomplete Nature, that in the sense that we are our way, our being, our consciousness like rise, like comes into being is precisely because we lack some things. And in a way, it makes sense, because if we didn't lack anything, if we were not incomplete in any way, we would be like a rock, right? We would just like sit there and like exist and do nothing, right? So it's just like, it's very ingrained in our existence that we're incomplete, so we're like a magnet constantly going towards something, right? That's like a prerequisite of ours. And then we have like, okay, so we have this incompleteness, and it manifests as desire, as need, as drive, as we mentioned. And then we're like, okay, and why is this interesting, right? Okay, because sometimes our desire screws us up, right? Like we don't like the things we desire, or the things we do because of our desires are something we don't like, right? So in a sense, it's interesting, because we go back to this, okay, so to these distinctions, okay, this drive, this need, this desire, but in relation of why would it be interesting, right, to define them or categorize them? And it's precisely because if we are forced to go into a certain direction, right, because we're incomplete and we strive towards something, right, the only thing that we are going to strive no matter what. So then the only thing we can choose is the direction. So for us, like, maybe that's why it's so so interesting, also valuable to understand the way we desire. So we go into the direction we want, and in the sense accepting our own limitations, as previously said, because we're not free in so many ways. We're not free, right? In so many ways, like in genetics, biology, like social conditioning, like we cannot think the way something in the 1800s thought. Like we cannot think that way because we're not contextual at the time, right? So we're not free in so many ways, but in the small window we have, make having choosing or guiding our desire to things that we, in our conditioning, in our limited, not free way, think it's nice. It's good. Maybe that's where the usefulness or like the meaning comes in, right? So that's just something I wanted to say.
Well, there's something very interesting, and Bethany had a wonderful. Bethany, you're outstanding. Thank you for being here.
And I like what she was saying on the oasis culture. That's very interesting. There's something about like you're saying, if you were complete, that would be that, right? But if you were too incomplete to yourself, that would be overwhelming and destabilizing, right? So there's this way in which you have to be incomplete, but not so incomplete that you feel fragmented, but then also not so complete that you just sit there like a rock. So what's very curious is it seems as if thought and desire have to relate to one another in such a manner that thought always has reason to continue. Desire always has a reason to motivate more thought, and where the incompleteness actually becomes essential to the human subject, and that if you got rid of it, that would be a problem. And yet the very nature of that tension is to motivate you toward getting rid of it. So how do you learn to resist that directionality of one's desires? Because it seems very natural to go in that way. And I'll just add to that is, in the same way that we were saying earlier that for Paul Virilio, the accident unveils the substance because it unveils what is the accidental to the white cat as opposed to the genetic code I was saying earlier. Likewise, there's something in coming to realize that desire cannot ever achieve a completeness without kind of effacing itself, with undermining itself, that then unveils the substance, the actual essence of the human subject, which is an entity that finds completeness in incompleteness. It's like the IN is in parentheses, is how I always like to write it. It's not merely incomplete versus complete, but an incompleteness with the IN in parentheses, where the incomplete structures the completeness back and forth, and that is the essential substance of the human subject, where if you get rid of that, which funny enough, it seems like you should, that would actually lead to some different trouble. So it's interesting how it seems like that tension, and I think that's some of the genius of Hegel, is to identify that tension as essential to things and to the human subject, as opposed to the thing that one wants to overcome and get rid of.
To that, I just want to say like a short sentence, which is, and it seems to me like that the game of saying yes to certain desires and no to other desires, there's an art to that game, and that's precisely the lot that we have. And obviously it unfolds in complex ways, but it seems like that's the only sort of possible interface we have available.
Now, Mr. Frigga, I have to say, I love the lighting effect that you did as you said that, where it got kind of darker and it's like night, the curtains coming down. That was really well timed. And everyone, Mr. Zach Fishman Highroot is here. I love this man. He is so beautiful. I want to ask, is there something, though, what I find very interesting, Mr. Frigga, since you're the resident expert on ontological design here, I just do cows, is there's something about how does one not fall into the temptation of using, say, ontological design in a manner to avoid incompleteness with the IN in parentheses in favor of, say, completeness? It would seem that actually coming to terms with the way that desire and thinking operates, as we've been saying, is really, really important in the game of ontological design, because if one is not, because one brings their ideas to their design, right? They bring, that's part of the thing, unless one knows to be more Hegelian about it and not try to plan the future. But that in of itself is a certain orientation that you bring to ontological design, where you say, no, I need to interpret more than, to go back earlier in the conversation, than plan. So, it would seem as if, I'd be curious how you respond to this, that actually a lot of what we're saying on the necessity of incompleteness in the formation of the human subject is really, really freaking critical to get as we move forward in a world of ontological design. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's the motion between incompleteness and other incompletenesses is what desire will do. And incidentally, the way to achieve maximum motion as a designer, to achieve maximum effects with your designs, and so to achieve the object of that desire, so that desire will migrate to the next best big thing, is exactly to understand that the best design gesture you can make is the purveyance of contradictions and their management intelligently, right? It's as much about the things you impose as much as it is about the things you restrict and the ones that you don't say, that you don't put on the paper. So, imagine that at this scale, you have a bunch of sort of interface things available to you, which is restrict, enable, block, don't say. Do that intelligently, and perhaps motion will be unlocked of a new layer, of a new scale. Well, you'll go from contradiction A to contradiction B. And does that mean that you will have achieved completeness? No, you will have unveiled a new level of incompleteness, which then requires new interpretation, new audit of territory, new strategy deployment to play with the next impossibility, and so on and so forth, forever. So it's really it's more like an engine kind of thing, rather than a let's find completeness once and for all here or in the other realm, I would argue. That doesn't mean it's not fun. Right?
Well, it's interesting you say that, Mr. Frigga, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. Mr. Fishman and I have been speaking a lot about action. Marcis Blondel, who was a great thinker that nobody read, but he wrote a really important book where he wanted to argue that philosophy exists because action exists. That if there was, and action is not merely acts, he makes this interesting distinction between acts and action, where an act is just kind of a thoughtless thing that you carry out, you pick up the water and so on and so forth, where action is where you really think about what you are bringing into the world and what you are carrying into the world, and it necessarily has a metaphysical dimension to it. And Mr. Fishman and I were discussing how does one ever stop being a rock climber? Well, no, you never stop being a rock climber, because you may reach the summit of a given mountain, but one does not ever stop being a rock climber. That becomes kind of the identity according to which you are always carrying out action within. So it's almost like ontological design is not so much a matter, and anyone can speak who would like. Ontological design is not so much metaphorically a matter of climbing a mountain as it is deciding if you're going to be a rock climber or a cake maker or a crazy guy who lives on a farm with 3 kids, that there is something about an identity of which entails under that identity action of which is never completed. And the identity itself has a kind of incompleteness embedded into it, because you never finish being a rock climber. You never finish being a guy that likes to swing sticks around. And so it seems like something like that is what is in operation.
You could I agree completely. And another way to put that is that if you're not lost in the discourse of the other and in a desire that is not necessarily your own, then you will also have to come to terms time and again with death as this sort of ultimate impossibility. And so establishing continuously this relationship with it is the sort of an impossibility that grants tremendous leverage for the deployment of other or navigation of other impossibilities. Leverage is I guess the term.
This we wanted to follow this idea of never stopping to be a rock climber one step further, to apply to how we interpret a resting place, because I think that's extremely important. How we think about a place that seems and feels stable to us, and in interpretation of our own life histories. For example, we might all have experienced this very restful place of explaining one of our shortcomings with reference to something in our childhood, like, oh, I have attention deficit because of this trauma when I was a child. Yeah, that's a very restful place, but don't stop treating that as a jumping point for future, interpretations. This could be, but yeah, this is like thinking about resting places as not final. This is, I think, where Kant really becomes useful as a resource for criticizing contemporary trauma theories. Like, yeah, don't think about a past trauma as a thing in itself. It is also a phenomenon. It is also something that we have some kind of mediated access to. It is not our final place from which we interpret everything and then we rest forever. That's it. Zach.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, Daniel. Daniel, you took the words out of my mouth with the reference to rock climbing in terms of completeness and incompleteness. I think that, like, to me, it's really important, as you're saying, to not think that we can reach some final completion. But as Dawood was just saying, like, I think it's very important to recognize that there is completion in rock climbing, right? Like, there is this motion of, like, you set a goal and then you accomplish it and then you're done, right? But then there's another goal there's another mountain to climb, right? And I think that for me, like, the language of resolution and in a musical context is very useful here. That, like, in music, there's always this movement away from the key center and then back to the key center. And when you return to the root, it resolves the musical statement, right? Da 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 da. And then once that's done, you can kind of like breathe a sigh of relief, right? But as soon as you do that, it's opens this space for another movement to emerge, right? And so I think it's important to not think that we can, like, create one final song that will end all songs. But I think it's also critically important to remember that, like, we need resolution. And the resolution, like, it defines a center, right? It defines a center is the right word. And without that, you just end up with this sort of atonal music that just sort of goes in all these different directions, but never resolves. And I mean, some people like that music. I'm not a huge fan, but I feel like without a center, without a key center, there's no harmony, there's no real melody. There's just kind of like this sort of kind of elevator music nonsense. And so, like, for me, when it comes to, like, Daniel Frege, I've listened to you before, and I'm fascinated by this concept of ontological design. But for me, the question, it always returns to worship, right? Because, like, there's, in any system of ontological design, there's always going to be competing designs, and there's going to have to be some selection mechanism by which one design is chosen over the other, right? So that would be a god. It's like we all worship this one god, and it's up to us to figure out what this god would want in this particular situation. And then you have a religious system by which to mediate that kind of relationship, right? And so, like, I'm perfectly willing to say that, like, we can't posit a god which is complete and perfect right now, that God himself needs to be in this process of becoming. But, like, how do we just, like, that's where the crux always comes in, is like, what do we worship? And I feel like introducing an idea of incompleteness is important, but I'm afraid that it's sometimes used to avoid the question of worship.
No, and then I'll pass it to Chichan and Ethan Nelson. Great to see you. There's a way in which stressing becoming over being can be problematic, because then becoming sort of becomes a stable state and you never ever actually try to become anything. But then being can be problematic because you're not becoming. So there has to be this kind of bothness. Likewise, incompleteness can become an excuse to not actually act upon incompleteness, right? Or to not actually engage in it. And what is curious, though, and then I'll pass it to Chichan, is what is the nature of the completeness that one has to somewhat seek and believe in? The language you're using is worship, in order to even act within that incompleteness in a manner that is plausible to them, or that feels like sacrificing themselves for, or giving themselves over to entirely. And as you know, that for me gets into the question of what I call alterology, the alternative ways of being, whether it be a singularity, a transcendent psychological state of being, a theological, these kind of alternative states, which becomes a big, big question in alterology. But Chichan.
Say two things. One is, I think it's a very interesting distinction between act and action that you're bringing out. I'm just remembering Hannah Arendt's critique of Marx, and which was that, in Marx, you see that thinking and action actually become opposite to each other, which is why Marx is trying to change the world. He's collapsing into action, so he's only able to act in your ways of thinking. And whereas when you actually are able to thinking and action, without posing them as opposite things, you're able to find something more in action than simply, as we were thinking of death in that sense, a system getting reduced to its own basic level. I think Dowd's point of resting place and belonging, I think, is extremely interesting, and it interested me, last time also. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is that when you start looking at how systems operate, systems don't always operate in continuous transitions. They operate in discrete ways. So for example, when you look at how electrons jump, they don't have continuous energy levels. They jump in what you call fixed quantas, in that sense, that you would have one energy level and then you have to jump to another, or you remain the same. There's no point in between the two things. And that is why when a compound or molecule has to bonds with another atom, in that sense, to form a molecule, it has to form those bonds in fixed energy levels. It cannot simply form bond in anything in between. And it is when you start thinking that point seriously, you start thinking about that humans' modes of belonging, or what you call co-individuating or cohabiting this world with others, always involves these discrete points at which we are able to form those distinct bases from which next jump or next movement forward can, because we are not living in a world where we get things in continuous movement. We get our movement in very discrete atomic, so you may work for 3 years, and then the next half an hour can be more fruitful to you. And again, 3 years, nothing might happen. You keep on reading, thinking, and you're in your own. That can, and I think it's a very interesting way to think. What I think, Dowd is saying is extremely interesting in that sense, to think about resting place in that sense, that human beings, world is not only a world of failures in that sense, of incompleteness in that sense, but also a world in which things are not really readily available to us immediately. It's a world which is always first through time. It's always diachronic in nature. Any synchronic immediate movement might not be the,
It makes me think onto that. So first off, you're exactly right on what you're saying about action and act. That's why Maurice Blondel was kind of hesitant to have action associated with pragmatism. He thought it was pragmatism that he was talking, but then when he kind of found out what William James and all them was talking about, he's like, no, that's not quite it. I'm almost talking about action. For him, interpretation and action are deeply tied together. Like intellectual undertakings are action. And so I always find Maurice Blondel in regard to action versus pragmatism very good. But the point you're making is wonderful. And Mr. Javier Rivera, it's a pleasure to see you, sir. Just in time to tell us about Martin Buber. Man, this works out. Fantastic. So this is great. But also, too, on what you're saying, it makes me think on this question of rest versus resolution. I don't actually know if it's true. I've never researched it myself, that sharks die if they stop swimming, but it's such a great metaphor that I'm going to use it. I've never gotten close enough to a shark to find out. But everyone always says that, sharks die if they stop swimming. So if we define rest for Javier, that picture of you with the dog is really something. That's really good. So there's a notion where if you were to tell a shark, hey, the meaning of life is rest, to stop moving, you're literally defining rest, what will kill the shark, right? So it's really important that you have the right idea of what constitutes resolution so that you don't, because of what a shark is, that you don't give it a definition of rest that ultimately results in the shark dying. Well, the funny thing is about human beings, it would seem as if we have a tendency to define for ourselves a kind of resolution that is actually like telling a shark to stop swimming. And what Hegel comes along, if we make tension and contradiction and movement and continual rock climbing, when we think of resolution in those terms, then it follows that that's the kind of resolution we need if indeed we are the kind of being ontologically that dies if we stop having action, just like a shark. So that's where ontology and self-definition are actually a really freaking big idea. Like the opening essay of The Conflict of Mind is truth organizes value. What you defined is what you think is true defines what you ought to do. Like is defines ought. It's not that you can never bring is and ought together. It's that is defines what constitutes ought. And so a shark is a shark, so it ought to keep swimming. Otherwise it dies. Likewise, a human is a being of whom has a contradictory nature to it that therefore needs to continue engaging in action, or the human undergoes effacement. So this is where actually this, and then to whoever wants to speak, including Javier's dog, because I think that the animal would have a very big contribution to bring to this conversation on the nature of reality and minor other small talk issues. But that's where Maurice Blondel with action is really kind of trying to define it from pragmatism, because he's saying, no, the nature, you cannot, he's kind of like, the problem with pragmatism is that it doesn't ask the question of what are human beings. It basically says, don't ask questions of truth. This is a generality. I'm not saying every pragmatist is like this, but a form of pragmatism is don't ask ontological questions. We can never get to a capital T truth. So don't worry about that stuff. That makes me think of like Richard Rorty or whatever. Just do what's practical, what's useful, what works. And Maurice Blondel comes and he's like, hey, buddy, the problem is you have to smuggle in a conception of what is the human being to define what in fact works, unless you're just talking about a hammer and nails. At which point, yes, empiricism will get there. You can just empirically observe that a hammer guts nails. But if you're talking about how human beings ought to define resolution, you're going to really need an ontological conception there. And if you skip that, you may end up defining rest for the human being in a manner that leads to his effacement, in the same way that you could end up defining rest for the shark as stop swimming, at which point the shark will die. And that's why I like what Maurice Blondel is doing in action. And with that, if anyone would like to speak, please.
There's something about the gradient between continuity and that which is discrete. And I'm sort of hearing this coming up over and over again in this conversation. And I think this sort of tension is something that we seem to all be circling around and trying to figure out, like, what is right relationship? Sort of like there's this continuous flow of energy that is in flux, and we kind of drop down into it. And that is where the sort of desire is most potent, but the least formed. And there's something about, as you kind of squeeze it out of that form into a discrete instance, you then trap certain aspects that become perceptible. And it sort of feels like that's the resolution. But if you then fixate on that, that is the equivalent of giving the shark the wrong definition. And so I think more than we are trying to find resolution in these conversations, we're trying to get really good at that process of kind of squeezing things out of the continuity into a discrete moment, and then knowing when is the right moment to drop back down. And I think, like Daniel might have used the word enjoyment or fun in that process. And I think that's another vector. It's like, how much fun can we have in this kind of dance of contraction and expansion?
Thanks, Tom. I wrote like a little picture here. That was really in a discrete, but that's good, Tom. I would give it to Dimitri.
Yeah, that's really good. What you're saying, and it connects to what I was getting at, because when we're again following Hegel in the lectures on logic, when we're thinking about sensuous things, it's not as hard because we can use the faculty of the understanding. But when we're thinking about the is in the sentence, the rose is red, then we certainly have to think about being, or if we start thinking about red, and red as a universal, not only roses are red, but also whatever. And that's really hard to do, to think the universal form of logical concepts. And Hegel literally says, perhaps I already mentioned it, but there's a strain involved with negation, and there's a strain involved with reflection, because in the very reflection of some kind of being you're getting to, you lose that being and it becomes self-othered subject. Hegel also says in the Phenomenology of Spirit that it's not simply that that it's the path of doubt, and that we're simply thinking, okay, do we have to go left or right? Is it A or is it B? But yeah, in German and Dutch, there's this special type of word. It is you have doubt or Zweifel, and you have Verzweiflung, which is being in a state of doubt itself. And he says in English, it's clunkily translated as the path of despair, which is not so accurate. But it's really this state of doubt or this state of despair that you have to learn to be with and enjoy itself. To add to what you were saying, I think that's right.
There seems to be a difference between, say, if I have the pen, I mentioned this with Guy Sinstock once, there seems to be a difference between holding a pen like this, where you clutch it, and that keeps anything from arising. But then there's something where you hold it like this because you can't hold the pen. It seems like it's something like holding it like this, which is difficult because you have to balance it. But there is what allows new things to enter, different things like that. So it's a different way of kind of approaching life, where you're not clutching, but you're also not dropping. You know, maybe this is modernism, the quest for certainty, as Mr. Fishman and I have discussed, postmodernism, where you just kind of get a nihilistic irony, even if it has a valuable place. Whereas what we're looking for is some sort of holding that makes space for movement and change, which allows for those different. I like how you brought. I had no idea about that, where it's the state of doubt. That's very interesting, Dimitri. So thank you. And then I'll pass it on to Highwood. I did want to say, David, I want to note that idea of Kant talking about like kind of using it in a therapeutic sense of saying, oh, that's just in the like trauma was in the phenomenon and how that like has a healing function to it. That was actually really interesting. I appreciate that, David. I meant to say that earlier, but Mr. Fishman.
Well, okay. So first of all, I love what Tom was saying about how like it's not about the resolution, it's about the relationship between the resolution and the tension, right? Because like in music, if you just start a movement and then immediately resolve it, there's nothing to that, right? On the other hand, if you go on this whole journey but never, and you resolve it 32 bars later, like it's not going to be great either. Although this would bring me back to my question of worship, right? Because like in classical music, for example, resolution often takes a long time, right? You often have to listen to it for a long time, and it sort of slowly comes back to the key center. Whereas in pop music, like if you don't have a resolution every 8 bars, then no one's going to listen to it, right? And so it once again raises the question of like, what is the right relationship? And I would say that it's like what you're talking about, how we take the process and draw it up into an instance, and then let it go back into the process, and that what we should be aiming at is the right way of doing that. I would say that way too needs to be like, that way is still, it's like at a meta level, you're drawing up the process of relating tension to resolution into a particular instance of like, this is the way that we relate tension to resolution, but that can become a fixed entity, which then needs to be dissolved and reformed, right? So it is like this recursive fractal process of exactly what you're describing, of process into instance back into process. But there's a question ultimately of like, what is the way of the way, you know what I mean? And like without worship, I don't see how we can figure that out and come into communion around it. And then just in terms of Daniel, what you're saying, like this relates to what you're saying about the pin, right? It's like, I've heard you use this metaphor before, and you talked about like holding a baby bird in your hand, right? You don't want to clutch it, you don't want to drop it either, so you use an open hand. It's like, okay, yes, when dealing with baby birds, best to use an open hand. When dealing with a chainsaw, best to use a firm grip, you know what I mean? And when rock climbing, you want to use minimal necessary force. You want to hold on, you don't want to over grip, because then you wear yourself out. And so it once again comes back to the way. And so like, what is the way? You know, I mean, that's just where I would take that. So yeah.
No, the bird thing is Michelle's, which gets referenced in every third comment because it's so fantastic. If you saw someone clutching the feet of a bird, you'd say they don't really own it. Someone who owns the bird or has a relationship, it flies off and comes back. So Michelle brings that up. And I think what we're also getting at, and Dr. Last has mentioned this, on the challenge of the part of religion in the phenomenology of spirit today, in the world today, that challenge of religion on community. Don't you need something to worship? What does that look like? Dimitri in the comments talked about the possibility of a non-way, which is not no way, but a non-way, the incomplete. This is to me, as I like to call, and then I'll pass it to Javier and then Dimitri, the question of alterology, as I brought up and keep mentioning. I think it's a fascinating question, and funny for me to bring up like some weird word when we have, such a short amount of time left, but I like doing that because it's fun that way. But Javier, please.
Yeah. I know I'm going in here pretty cold, but I'm just picking up from what has been kind of just said. I think if we're talking about like the way, I'm kind of going to use like some Buddhist notions here, because I think before we talk about the way, we need to talk about like how do we cultivate discernment. This is like very common in traditional Buddhism, where you have to be able to discern between the sound, hearing, and then the object. So there's two objects of materiality. There's the object that is making the sound. Then there is your ear that is allowing the sound. And then there's the arising of the hearing, all in that moment. You could say the problem with clutching the bird is that you're not allowing any discernment, right? You're just squeezing it, right? So how can you discern between your hand and what is being squeezed? And I know in a very tangible experience, we could see that we are squeezing the bird, but we need to make these very subtle discernments between, the object, and then there's the visual field, and then there's the actual seeing that occurs. So there's three discernments you have to make that Buddhism proposes, which is very subtle, but I think it's very significant to what we're talking about. When we're sort of trying to say, like, when we're trying to allow something to arise, right? How do we allow something to rise if we can't discern what is arising, basically? Yeah, that's just really my question.
About the way and the non-way. Nietzsche says in Also sprach Zarathustra, there is no way. There's your way, but there is no way. And then when we're talking about the way, we're talking about the metaphysical way. And Hegel directly equates metaphysics with logic. So I just speculating, maybe there is a non-way, and the non-way is just the metaphysical logic and this whole process itself. But it's all encompassing, even with its own negation, and that's all there is. And then he just left. I believe someone was just making Tom. Yeah, he was just making the point about getting better at being with that whole process. So yeah, I think that's what you said, that's a part of it, to be able to be present with that and not get caught in the flux of appearances and just kind of be slavish with that.
Yeah, that was a very interesting question. And to me, it has, I think, starting to answer it has to do with recognizing that the hand itself gives us a path. It gives us a way. The way of the hand is a full grasp. And if we only recognize that path, then of course we will kill the bird. And the bird also has its own path, has its own way. And these, now I'm reminded of what Chetan said about these discrete and qualitatively different planes of existence. That you can't continuously go or continuously step by step gradually link what the hand is doing to what the bird wants to do. There has to be a leap or there has to be a recognition that these two paths are so different that they could, it's difficult to kind of create a negotiation between them, a dialogue between them. And maybe a third path can arise out of that dialogue between what the hand wants and what the bird wants. And that recognition that these are, the resolution, the hand wants its own resolution, musical resolution, which is if you quickly satisfy that demand for a resolution, again, it can be destructive. But yeah, thank you for the question. And this is, I think, my last time to talk. So thanks a lot, Daniel. I think you're doing an amazing job holding this space and managing the conversation. So, and thanks everybody else who's here. This was a joy, a delight.
Well, you are a beautiful soul and you are very kind, and I really appreciate everyone being here. If anyone else has any last remarks, please, I will comment a few things. First, for me, the phenomenology of the artist and the creative act is particularly useful for this space. Mr. Fishman has been mentioning high root on music, resolution, say how it has this bothness to it. I find music very, very helpful because metaphors matter, and the metaphors you use structure your thinking, whether one likes them to or not. And so kind of really, for me, paying attention to various creative acts is very helpful. It becomes a source of ways to, because in art, resolution is not finality. It's different, like Mr. Fishman is mentioning with music, right? So that's one point. Second, there seems to be a difference between the question of can you make the way the no way in the act of the thing for the individual, and it seems like you can. Nietzsche gives one a very good blueprint for how to do that. But then the question becomes, what about between 5 people? What about 10 people? At the end of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he's waiting for his children still, right? He's waiting for, and I think we can actually view Thus Spoke Zarathustra as Zarathustra, not merely, I think, and I was mentioning, Cadell and I were talking about this. A lot of people can read Zarathustra as a man looking for enlightenment. No. He already has enlightenment. He's going into the world to find people to participate in it and who can handle it. Now that requires him to face his shadow, to face the pit. Like there are things because there are ways the subject has to face themselves when they try to communicate. So it's not merely getting other people to join on, but you also have to undergo certain self-transformations to be someone who can handle that. So Zarathustra can be positioned in different ways as trying to move into spirit and religion in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, and then ultimately absolute knowing, because that's going to be effused through the whole thing. But it's not merely a journey of enlightenment. It's this question of how does one engage in community with this new sort of form of where the act that one should engage in is the hand, right? Like Dawood is saying. That I think is $1 million question. And the last thing I'll say before giving it to Dimitri, and then anyone else, please, any final remarks, is to me the metaphor I think about is a dance. A dance is really interesting if you're doing a partner dance, because there is like an idea of what you're supposed to do, but they're simultaneously reading the other person and you're reading them and you're responding live, and it's not totally formulaic, even though there are some moves that are pre-practice. It's a mixture between practice and response, right? And like a truly great ballroom dancing event is like unbelievable, the amount of silent communication that can happen with a lot of practice. There is indeed a lot of formulaic practice, but it's almost like when you enter into the dance space, it transcends the formulaic practice into something that is also responding live to what is occurring. All right, so it's something, to me, the question of community in these new terms is something like metaphorically a dance, which is a phenomenology of art, and I'm trying to sneeze and not letting myself sneeze, so my brain's gonna blow up. Okay, no, it did not blow up. I'm still here. So then the question is this. All right, it does seem as if community in this new way is possible to some degree, but what about if you scale it? All right, so 2 people can do the dance. Okay, well, maybe 3, 4, what about 1 million? What about 100 million? And that becomes the problem of scale, right? Like it would seem like, Zarathustra can find maybe 10 kids. Okay, but what about 100? What about a society of children of Zarathustra? What does that look like? And this gets us, of course, I'm alluding to and then I'll pass it to Dimitri because, at the end, I like to throw out some giant subjects. This gets kind of into the subject of the game A, game B discussion, game/AB, game/DQRSTUV. That gets into that on the question of scale. But with that, I'll pass it to Mr. Dimitri.
Yeah, this has been a wonderful discussion and so so much has come up from everyone. I actually wanted to ask a question, which is a huge question again, and that is enlightenment and absolute knowing the same? Are you thinking of them as the same thing? If so, which one is higher? Is it absolute knowing? Is it enlightenment? How do we think about that?
I'll just add in I in my work make a distinction between enlightenment and absolute knowing, where enlightenment is kind of a final state where you're kind of rest, and that's what we've said the shark dies, whereas absolute knowing is a point where you know your limits, but then see yourself as the source of those limits. So there's an ever reconstitution. So it's a limit that has a perpetual motion that is part of it, and that's very elaborate. I tried to, in that conversation with Cadell last, talk about absolute knowing. There's a sense in which you can call it a kind of enlightenment of contradiction, but usually when people use the word enlightenment, it means a kind of like finality or different things. Now, if one wants to define that the finality is an ever reconstitution, at that point, what does the word finality mean? It seems like, what is it? What's the finality of being a rock climber? There's a sense in which there's a finality in that, but there's another sense in which there isn't a finality in that. So I'll pass it on to Chitan, but I think that's a marvelous question, and then we'll give it to Javier.
Thank you, Daniel. I'll not attempt to answer that question. But yeah, thanks, Daniel, for a wonderful discussion, actually. I'll just sort of make a distinction of which I'm thinking a lot about. I have not thought it through. It's just two words that I've got from internet, but it's a distinction that even Zizek made in one of his lectures. So he makes a distinction between Zizek never names these things. I'm naming them like this because I heard it somewhere. But the distinction between infinite and finite games. So there are games that have a start, middle, and an end, where you can win, lose, where you're competing with others, and so on and so forth. And then there are forms of games which do not have a start, middle, and end, where you do not are competing, where you will win, so somebody has to lose. That distinction doesn't exist. If you look at children, that is what Zizek sort of talk about. That you can make it a male-female distinction also in Lacanian thinking. That's where Zizek came from. If you look at kids play a lot of such games where they're simply enjoying exchanging something with somebody else without the game having a fixed start and a finish in that sense, or without even one of them winning completely. Somebody will say, "Oh, ab main jeet gaya." Someone will say, "I just won." Somebody else will say, "I won," and that discussion goes on. Those are not games that have fixed. And we continuously engage in these forms of games, which are infinite games in some senses, which are games which do not have these fixed. And if you look at your relationship with dance, for example, that you gave an example of, the form of an infinite game in many ways, or this question of holding a bird in your hand. It's a game that you're playing with something. Wittgenstein uses game in this sense a lot in his writings. But it's a game which is never reaching its finality in that sense. It's a constant engagement with something because of which you're able to discern, you're able to engage, and so on and so forth. The thing with a game like this, and one can immediately see it in dance, that it comprises of two things. One is pure techniques, this issue of technology, technique, and so on and so forth. The other is creativity, expression, and so on. And these two things, in a very strange way, come together. I remember, I think Nietzsche saying somewhere that you can't know God if you can't dance. And if you look at gods across, for example, if you look at Hindu mythology, most of the gods can dance. That idea of being able to act without, where technique and that creativity comes together in some senses, where it's not coming through. Simondon had a very nice sort of a word for it. He called it transductive relation, a relation in which the terms are not pre-given before the relation exists. The terms of the relation actually arises from the relation itself. Dance is one of those things that the movement actually arises from the rhythm itself. Those movements are not given. You can practice those movements before, but when those movements are born, they are born because of your relationship with the rhythm itself. They cannot be given to you in advance of the rhythm that you're dancing upon, in some senses. And I think that's where we need to. It's something I just think that they are all over the place, but some things you can, I think, can think alongside of in this kind of discussion. Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much.
So I briefly just want to address the scale, the question of scale. I think if we look historically at religion, the question of scale is always present. I think Japan's a really good example where we have the notions of the Chronicles of Japan, where it fell into it. Buddhism became an object essentially to be traded. But then there's a question of immigrants and how that was already present, right? So there's this tension between elitism and sort of regular lay people. The question of scale, the Nietzschean scale is basically very elitist in my opinion, but also the overman, in my opinion, is also an impossibility, right? The very fact that Nietzsche asks you to throw it away the moment you create something already shows how the overman is an impossibility. He has to stay an impossibility in order for you to constantly turn to it. But yeah, the question of the scale for Nietzsche would have to be this question, in my opinion. What does the overman look like for a layman, for the everydayness of a layman, right? Because, I mean, I know we're here in our philosophical circle. I think for all of us, we could easily be, strive towards more of Nietzsche's children. We could do that. But I'm talking about the regular person. What does that look like? Because that's how we think scale, in my opinion. And that question. Because obviously, if we just stay in this realm of thinking, then yeah, the problem of scale is always going to be present, because basically it's a very elitist, notion. It becomes this problem of this. So that's really my question is, because I think religions have answered this through different denominations, basically different sections, right? So if overman is to be something that is communal in any sense or any real sense, someone has to initiate a section of overman that is for lay people, that is for other different types of people, in order for it to become an actual communal scale project, in my opinion. And for me, this is just kind of like proof of itself if we just follow history, the way religion has evolved and so on and so on. But yeah, that's just like my final comments.
I'll say one thing here about Nietzsche, which I hesitate to do because I haven't really read Nietzsche. I've kind of like skimmed through Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but I can't help but see this tremendous irony in Nietzsche, which is that on the one hand, he's saying, give me the kingdom of earth, forget about the kingdom of heaven, right? I don't want these lofty transcendental principles that I have to conform to. It's all this sort of like bottom up through the body and through feeling it out and all this. But then it's like he doesn't address the body once. Like his whole vision for the overman is sort of this heavenly image, right? It's like Ezekiel's vision of God on the throne. It's like this glowing, overflowing ball of light that you kind of have to look at through your fingers, but like there's no embodiment of it, right? Unlike the real Zarathustra, the historical Zarathustra, who came down the mountain and said, here is the law, right? Like here is the way to move your body so as to live in accordance with God, right? And like I don't know if this is the same in Zoroastrianism, but like in Hebrew, the word, don't quote me on this, but the Hebrew word for the law is translated as the way, right? So it's like, here's the way that you do that. And you could say that Judaism is too legalistic and rigid and all of that, and I would agree with you. But I can't help but see this tremendous irony in Nietzsche, and just the fact that the overman, like he fails, like Zarathustra fails. I'm sorry, but he went out to try and find a community and failed, and he ended up in a cave with his great men, and they died, and he failed to protect them. And instead of admitting his failure, he just said, well, it doesn't matter. I actually succeeded because this day is all about me. My sun is rising. And it's like, I'm sorry, but I don't see, like, I just don't see it. So I'm sorry to leave on a very negative poo-poo note, but I would insist on the necessity for the way, and I would also insist on the necessity for the non-way and the becoming of the way and the dissolution of the way and the reconstitution of the way and all that. But I would stand on the way. You know what I'm saying? So those are my final remarks. Daniel, thank you so much for hosting this. Thank you to everybody else. It was really nice to talk to you guys. Thank you. Pizza.
Now, I will
Happy,
say,
happy.
you know,
I will say that the first person Zarathustra encounters is kind of the priest in the forest who is like, love animals and don't go among mankind. And he's like, no, I'm going to go among people. There is a way in which Nietzsche in Zarathustra is trying to put, dare I say, divinity in finite, in flesh, in body, and that you're trying to kind of elevate that. Whereas, you know, overcoming the last man, rather than say, give in to the human tendency to say, eat, drink, and be merry, overcome man. Like overcome those kind of natural tendencies to be the last man and raise oneself up to the occasion. Now, what could be argued is that there is something about Zarathustra that does seem, precisely because becoming an overman is hard, therefore, whatever is hard by definition is what a minority will do. You can say that's elitist, but it's actually just kind of probability theory, right? I mean, if it is hard, a minority of people will do it. Therefore, you know, and so there's something about the overmen of which could be said to be something that a minority of people would do, even if what is being put forth is in fact what needs to be done. Like it is actually like we do need to rise to the occasion of ourselves and not become last men and so on and so forth, which then kind of begs the question I think that Javier is getting at, which is the $1 million question of, okay, let's take Christianity. All right, Christianity, there's, you know, if we follow, say, I would say, you know, N.T. Wright, I guess, is the most prominent Christian theologian who wants to say that Jesus is not a Platonist. Jesus is actually sacrificial. The kingdom of heaven is on earth, that it's about resurrection, not, say, going to heaven and so on and so forth. And you say that's kind of the true Christianity. And there's a lot of that. You can even say mysticism and different things like that. It's like, okay. But the issue is that once Christianity starts to scale and it starts to expand, if you want to get the layman of people involved, it tends to become more Platonic, right? It becomes more disembodied and going out, and that almost seems like a necessary component to help it scale. Oh, crap. So how exactly, so something can be lost. Like a lot of times, many religious traditions in their mysticism is quite nuanced and quite fascinating and quite well done. But then once it starts to scale, there can arise some sort of different problems that are very difficult to work out. And in fact, arguably, philosophy, which say with the Enlightenment tried to have truth and goodness itself be a motivating principle, like if it is rational, you should do it. It's like, that didn't tend to work. So it kind of gave the question of motivation over to economics with incentives and how do you get the average person to go to work and contribute to economics, because that's how you start to take care of, say, the layman in terms of motivation, when, say, maybe the more overman-esque individual does not need the economic incentive. They just need the notion of the truth, the beautiful, and the good, and that will be motivational to them. Well, likewise, it would seem that what Nietzsche is putting forth can, in fact, be quite useful to a lot of people, you know. But if it's not the layman, I think that Javier is getting at, well, then you have a scale problem, which is the same problem, to Nietzsche's defense, that basically every single religion has, every ideology has, every business has. Like, how does a free market, you know, how does small, you know, if capitalism works as small business or whatever, well, the more it scales, it tends to go toward corporatism, right? It becomes like different than what it is as a libertarian free market paradise, arguably that never existed, like a Cornel West will say. But anyway, the problem of scale seems to be such a paramount issue, because in the scaling, there becomes possible transformations of the fundamental ideas that were put forth that can be lost in the process of that scaling. But no, the question of scale, I think, is fascinating. I very much appreciate also the infinite finite game that was brought out. It would also seem to be that individuals of whom are able to rise to the occasion of being overmen can select infinite games that do not, say, get them stuck in participating in a totalitarian ideological or empty cycle. Whereas, say, unfortunately, incentives can end up for the average person, the infinite game that they participate in is maybe something that just feeds the socioeconomic order of the day. So how does one choose or create their own infinite game, which I would associate with Nietzsche's child, right? You know, where you go the camel, the lion, the child, where Nietzsche's child is creating their own values and finds an infinite game in that is sublimative as opposed to effacing, but that seems to be a very big challenge. And even if it is possible for, say, given individuals to do that, how can it be something that millions of people can do, which again sounds elitist, but it is not elitist once we just simply understand that it is hard. And we're not saying a given individual will do it. We are saying that whatever is hard is by definition what the minority of people will do, in the same way that a minority of people say run friggin' 5Ks. Is that elitist to say that a minority of people run 5Ks? No, running 5Ks is hard. So if you were to create so let's put it this way. If you were to create a socioeconomic order that functionality is contingent upon the average person running a 5K, it will not work. It will probably fail. It will not last, or it will be perverted along the way. So that poses a problem if what we are talking about is ultimately the new kind of identity or motivation people need is a coming to terms with a certain essential incompleteness that then drives them to be creative in a manner that is very individual, because that is very hard. But we are suggesting that that's basically what needs to be done. But that is like asking the average person to make the socioeconomic order work, run a 5K. That seems like a problem. So where do we go from there? So that would be a way that I would put it. You are all beautiful people. Thank you for being here today, because this question actually totally fascinates me. In the equivalent of everyone being an overman. Yeah, I think it's very clear. Look, if people are overmen, a lot of these pathologies and different things we see developing can be overcome. But what about getting everyone to run a 5K? And yes, and Javier, the problem of conditionality. But anyway, you are all beautiful people. Thank you for being here. I've enjoyed it very much.